Hi everybody, happy Wednesday. Today we're starting chapter 2 called Understanding Theory. Welcome to my living room. You can see some concert posters I got framed in the background. Hope everybody enjoyed chapter 1. I've had a few questions largely about discussion board. That's not going to start till this chapter. I'll give you some directions on that at the end of this video and an email. But no discussion board for chapter 1. That starts for this chapter, and then you'll have to do 6 of them. What else? I think chapter 1 was short and fairly straightforward. Don't have any questions, but if anyone has any general questions about it, feel free to let me know. If you need some additional material, maybe some good introduction videos into what is sociology generally, feel free to ask me. I can send them to you individually or post them on UB Learns for People. Which reminds me, some of you asked me, due to being out of the country, if I could post the video lectures that are going on UB Learns on YouTube. So I made my own YouTube channel, and it's the same videos. I may post a few other things on there, but still everything you need will be in UB Learns. But some people in other countries can access YouTube easier than UB Learns. The link to that is in the email I sent you, as well as on the announcements page on our UB Learns page. So if you have any questions about that, can't find the link, let me know, I'll send it to you. That's that for now. So let's start chapter 2. So chapter 2 is called Understanding Theory. And by this we mean sociological theory. And so we can start off by thinking about sociology generally, but particularly sociological theory, as about particular ways of thinking about how the world works. You can hear the truck outside. And wait for that to get on the street. Okay. So sociological theory, much like sociology itself, is about different ways of thinking about how the world works. And so in sociology, we generally think about there being 3 main schools that we're going to talk about. But first, a theory allows us to think about what is a social structure, what are the different things that constrain us and shape us, and that also frame and shape interactions between people. So a theory is really just how do we explain why what is happening is happening. Theoretical perspectives, on the other hand, are schools. So within a perspective, there are multiple theories related to that school. So you have 3 main schools: structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And so there are different types of different types of conflict, functionalist, and interactionist theories. So we've got the broad, we've got the specific within the broad. So before we move on, theories are particular ways of seeing the world. Think of them as particular types of glasses you put on. They are not necessarily in opposition to the other theories. Sociology as a discipline, I think, is at its richest and most comprehensive when we try to use all 3 or even more perspectives as much as possible. My way of thinking about these ways of thinking, these theoretical schools, are in 3 tiers. Or not tiers, but kind of 3 types. And so functionalism I think of as explaining order. why things stay the same. Conflict theory explains change, because there's a conflict going on that at least some people want changed. So conflict is about change. And then symbolic interaction is about meaning. So we've got order, change, and meaning. Some people don't want the social order to be changed. Some people really want it to be changed. And that can be determined by the meanings people attach to things. So for example, people have very different ideas about what it means to be an American. Culturally, racially, ethnically, legally, geographically. And so what some people want changed is a particular type of social order, how we think about what is American, that some people don't want to see enlarged or just changed. So the way we interpret certain types of things determines whether what's kind of happening is order or change. We can think of meaning as something that really kind of straddles or connects thinking about social change and thinking about social order. Another thing about this is that think like someone waving, winking at you, maybe raising their eyebrows to you in a bar. That may excite one person. They may see that as a potential marriage partner. Marriage is a particular part of our social order because it's bonding. Two people are entering into a partnership. So that person gets really excited. They want to meet this person, have an interaction, date. The way that person does that, or the way someone interprets it, for another person might seem really creepy and therefore offensive. Maybe they won't stop staring at them. They keep winking. Who knows what they're doing, but it's creeping the other person out. And so in that case, this is a behavior it's often, a way that men act towards women publicly, like in bars. And so living in a more equal society would entail people, particularly women, not feeling like they're being harassed when they're in public. So in this case, what is order or potential order for one person is really something that someone else wants to see changed. Gay rights is a kind of a really easy example to think about this, kind of pendulum of order and change. And some people don't see same-sex relationships as legitimate as opposite-sex relationships, in which case some people attach very different meaning to same-sex relationships compared to opposite-sex ones. And so it's the meaning people attach to how we define what is a proper partnership that really creates the circumstances for some people wanting or not wanting the social order to be changed. That's kind of the conflict there. All right. So that's our intro to sociological theory. The first thing we want to think about is structural functionalism. So this is most famously associated with the French sociologist Emile Durkheim. I'm not big on quizzing or testing you on names, but we can generally think about functionalism as concerned with social order. Another term for that is social solidarity. So things that give us order and solidarity are some big things that we call institutions. We can also think of things that create patterns in society, because patterns create stability. So on an individual level, the handshake is something people do to introduce themselves to each other, to show they're not a threat and to show they're being friendly. So So we have that on a kind of individual level. On a larger level, the family unit as a form of social organization is how people come together. Religion, education, the media, the law is a big one. These are things that people decide on as institutions that give societies stability. So everyone gets at least a baseline of education. Everyone has to follow the same laws. We're all exposed or have the ability to access media. We still generally consider two parents as kind of the basis for a family unit, and that is certainly something codified in law. So these are kind of the big things that give society stability and particularly predictability. So education, I think, is the easiest one. All of you are at UB. Well, some of you might be taking this class for transfer credit, but the majority of you, at least, are UB students getting a UB education. You have some kind of high school degree. In America, we call it the high school diploma or GED. If you're from a different country, there's some kind of equivalent, some type of degree you have that prepares you to then get a college education, either in your home country or elsewhere. And so that is a process, really kind of a rite of passage that people go through to make them proper citizens of a society. So these are things that also we can think of as promoting social harmony or social order. You'd want to check out, I think, the video I posted on UB Learns. So I posted a lot of videos for you on UB Learns for this chapter to take you deeper and broader into what is sociological theory. So that gives you some opportunities to teach yourself. But I want to touch on a little bit Durkheim's really kind of famous theory for thinking about social order comes from his idea of solidarity, and that comes from studying primitive society, particularly the transition from primitive society to modern society. And so paradoxically, he calls primitive societies, so these are small tribal societies where everybody knows each other. You don't really have what we would in modern society call individual identity. How you think of yourself is essentially the group. People are kind of automatons, and you don't do anything you think might violate group morality. So think of this as like a herd mentality. For any of you who've seen the latest King Kong movie, the one with Samuel L. Jackson and Tom Hiddleston, that is a perfect example of a primitive society when they crash land on the island that has King Kong on it. But the video that I have on UB Learns also touches on this. So you can really think of it as people having one identity, and that's the group identity. That's why we call it mechanical, because people are like robots. When we transition to modern society, we now have lots of different school roles we take on. We have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or a husband or a wife. We have friends. We have teachers, other authority figures, maybe bosses at our job. I know some of you have jobs because you've emailed me about work schedule stuff. So that's a status and a role you have, this role as a employee or professional. Maybe you're on some sports teams. I'm on a soccer team. That's a role that I have and a status. So you have lots of different identities and personas that you engage in, oftentimes within the same day. But these roles don't necessarily overlap. The people who are on your sports team or who you work with don't know the people who you go to school with or the people who are in your family or your girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, or wife. And so you have disconnected identities that don't necessarily overlap. In modern society, one of the kind of, if not, it could be awkward, but if it's not awkward, particularly interesting forms of social interaction is when you have maybe a friend or a group of friends from one particular part of your life meeting for the first time your friends from a different part of your life. This could be past friends, say in my case, friends from back where I'm from near Pittsburgh, meeting friends I now have in Buffalo, friends I made in college in Central West Virginia, meeting friends I now have in Buffalo. People who knew me back when I was a teenager, meeting people now who only know me as an adult with lots of gray hair. And so people know you in different contexts, and sometimes those overlap, and those different ways of knowing you when they come into contact with each other are interesting. So this is why Durkheim calls modern society, so this is society since the Enlightenment. We won't talk a whole lot about what the Enlightenment is. But in modern society, our identities are fluid. Even though this is going to mix metaphors, it's like we take off one mask and put on another. What else we got? I think the last big part for functionalism we want to think about are manifest and latent functions. Manifest functions are institutions that, the manifest function of an institution is what the institution was created to do. Education creates a populace. It educates a populace. Governments make laws people have to follow, and they disobey those laws and they're punished to give societies a sense of stability. So the manifest function is what we think of an institution as doing. So say, a manifest function, I'm trying to think of a good example. The media is there to educate and inform, keep people aware of what is happening in the world. But institutions also have latent functions. And so latent functions we could think of as the unintended and unplanned consequences of how institutions operate. So take the latent function of, a latent function would be an unintended consequence, but that is not necessarily negative. It could be negative. So a latent function of the media might be lots of people find out about better jobs elsewhere in the next town, and lots of people move. And so that could be bad for that particular town. The media tells us that Rochester, an hour away from Buffalo, has lots of better jobs. Lots of people move, therefore shrinking Buffalo's tax base. That's a latent function of the media, because the media is not designed to make people move. But we can also think of latent functions as ones that don't have negative consequences. So think about the way the family unit supports society and reproduces our sense of what society is. Parents raise their children, but parents can also, if they encourage their children start working as teenagers in high school, so like many of you have done, then the family, and maybe, traditionally, particularly back like mid-century, maybe like my parents' generation, children working in high school, the income they brought in was essential to the family income and family well-being. We see this particularly in working class families. And so in this case, the family unit is essential, or can be essential, for producing future workers. People start working quicker. Or in families where people have to pull their own weight, say cooking, cleaning, doing chores. In some ways, the family unit can kind of run like a business. And the family unit essentially creates at a young ages future well-trained employees for the workplace. And so that's a positive example, or at least a neutral one. A dysfunction is when an institution causes all kinds of problems. So take, for example, the creation of the modern highway system. That obviously really connected different parts of cities to each other, cities to suburbs, people are able to commute better and have shorter commute times to work. They're able to work outside of the main place they live. So kind of pre-1950, pre-1940, the suburbanization we take for granted, the highway system, didn't exist. So that's kind of a modern feature we take for granted. What we didn't predict? Pollution. How in some cases some highways were built right through urban neighborhoods, essentially splitting, even destroying some traditional urban neighborhoods, often many of which are ethnically concentrated. So dysfunctions are problems that we can't even try to rationalize as positive. Pollution and neighborhood dissolution are generally not positives. Well, pollution's never positive. Neighborhood dissolution, probably not positive. And so that's kind of the tiers of manifest function to latent function to dysfunction or malfunction, right? So the units of analysis for structural functionalists are usually very large, what we would call macro. So in sociology, we have the macro, say like countries, the meso, which would be medium or moderate, say like a school or a city, and the micro is individuals. And so structural functionalist types of studies, tend to study at the macro level. So that's your intro to functionalism. Really, it's about social order. And the next will be social change. I'm going to take a short break. Actually, no, I'm not. Oh, yeah, I am. And we're back. UPS brought me a package. So, before we move on, our textbook authors use the case of the Mativ family to explain all three perspectives. And I suggest looking at that section of the textbook to get a good gauge on how the three schools of sociology give us a way to see and explain the same phenomenon or case. So now we're on to conflict theory. And so conflict theory, as you can tell by the name, is largely about the very opposite of order, stability, and harmony. And that's conflict. And so we can largely think about this as society being defined by continual conflict between those with power and those without power. And so, generally for our purpose, we can think of the power in economic terms as what the famous German sociologist Karl Marx calls the bourgeois. So this is page 24. So this is what he calls the rich owners of production. And so now we can think of it as any person in a position of power, boss, administrator, president, people who like their power, don't want it chipped away at, and don't want to see their power eroded by further empowering people below them. And so for Marx, the bourgeois owns and controls the means of production. And so at that time, so this is kind of the Victorian era, and for Marx, at this time, this is the rise of modern industry. Think like steel mills. And so the main form of work for people other than agrarian work, farming, was working in a factory. And so you essentially either owned the factory or you worked in it. People who owned the factories were usually kind of historic aristocracies, landowners, people born into wealth, people with rich estates, aristocrats. So you really only had two classes of people: those with power, those without power. And so, working in a factory in, say, Victorian England was a bad gig. Don't have the worker rights, protections that you have today, say in terms of you can only work so many hours a week. You have to have sanitary work conditions, injury leave, if you have an injury while on the job. During that time, Victorian era, you get hurt on the job, it's your problem, you're probably going to be fired because you can't work for a while. You're replaceable. Now we have at least some protections protecting your job should something happen that is not your fault, or even if it is your fault. And so those people on the front lines are what Marx calls the proletariat. And there's another term called the lumpen proletariat, which are the unemployed. And so factory workers, bosses, think modern society, for example. To whatever extent they can, bosses will control positions or hours to control their own workforce. So there's always more people looking for work than there is work. That allows people to keep hours and wages low, strip workers of really having a lot of workplace power, because that makes them replaceable. And so the big thing for Marx that I think we want to think about and want to study is his idea of false consciousness. And so false consciousness for Marx is how, take a modern society, you work at a 7-Eleven, maybe a Best Buy. But Best Buy is a good example because a big thing for Marx is working in a kind of mundane environment where you're maybe being forced to create or sell, in the modern context, things that you yourself cannot afford with the wage you work at that place. So like, how many hours at Best Buy would you have to work trying to sell other people TVs to afford that very TV? I doubt most people grow up thinking they want to be TV salesmen or electronics salesmen. And so for most people, in sales in that case, they have a job that they have to pay the bills. It's a stepping stone, hopefully, to a better job, maybe while they're finishing school. Take working maybe 7-Eleven or McDonald's. Those aren't jobs. People maybe, for that point in their life, want them because it'll improve their life, but it's not what something does as their calling. It's not what something does it probably doesn't make them happy. It's not a passion. And so What Marx calls false consciousness is you're so drained from doing boring, mundane work, think being in a factory pulling a lever all day. And so you're doing work that makes you miserable and kind of divorces you from your own sense of self and your own passions that you might pursue. In some cases, we can think of false consciousness as a certain kind of depression. But false consciousness is also when you internalize the values of the kind of place you're working at. So if you're working at, say, a Best Buy, McDonald's, you just care about selling as much as possible, making profits to make your bosses happy. And so rather than maybe trying to be a good employee to your colleagues, trying to be a good salesperson to customers, all you care about is making the company as much money as possible because that's good for you. At the bottom line, it won't get you fired. Even better, maybe it gets you promoted. And so false consciousness is when you internalize the values of that workplace, which are not necessarily moral or ethical values. Alienation is also something we can think of as a kind of depression, which is where we become divorced from our own passions and what we want to do. And so we're not in a job that we live to get up every day and do. In the case of, say, working at Best Buy or 7-Eleven or McDonald's, Walmart, you don't even necessarily make enough to pursue your passions outside of work. So your job should not necessarily be your passion. You know, there's something to be said for having a good job that pays your bills, that allows you to do the things you want to do outside of work, like have a good time with your family. And that's totally fine. Plenty of people want to be stockbrokers, but I don't know how many people live to be a stockbroker. They like the salary being a stockbroker allots them to then do the other stuff they want to do when they're not working, and that's totally fine. But you have to have a job that allows you to pursue those passions, like maybe pottery or gardening or hiking, when you're not on the job. So that's what Marx calls alienation. It's kind of being divorced from your creative self. Your true consciousness would then be feeling like you're in touch with your real self, who you want to be. And so for, kind of modern day conflict theory, particularly in terms of expansion of rights, think of the rise of unions, the rise as really a major mitigating factor between bosses and workers, which allowed for the rise of the modern middle class. Expansion of voting rights, as an example. Tariffs on foreign goods to protect American workers. So that's an example of a conflict between countries. Workplaces going on strike. Some of you may have heard about teachers going on strike in a few different states across the country in the last year, including my home state of West Virginia, as a way to get people in charge to listen to them. Criminal behavior as a response to maybe lack of good jobs. So these are all kind of things enveloped with the conflict perspective, though it obviously includes gender inequality, racial inequality, and things of that nature. Marx has us thinking initially about economic inequality. So we're thinking about what are the causes and consequences of poverty. How do people respond to poverty? Crime is one of them. So we can think of one conflict, maybe that between cities and police and the homeless. Say new ordinances to make it harder to be homeless in cities. Where do those homeless people go? So those are all kind of modern examples of the conflict perspective. Black Lives Matters, big example of conflict theory in terms of racial persecution. The modern Me Too movement, example of workplace harassment, or as a way to mitigate and eliminate workplace harassment in the way that men sometimes kind of harass and bully women in the workplace. So the big thing to think about with conflict theory before we move on is the differential and the conflict between those with certain kinds of power and those who do not. Oh, before we move on, issues with college campus sexual assault. As college students, all of you have heard, obviously, know of and even live those issues. You know, how you act in parties, how much you're drinking, who you hang out with, go home with. That's an example of conflict theory as well. All right, gonna take another quick break, get some water. I know this is a long lecture. I suggest you probably taking a break too. Then we're going to go over our last one, which is symbolic interactionism. Here we go again. I needed some water. So our last part, we'll be talking about this more in another chapter on socialization. So this will be maybe a tad shorter than the sections on functionalism and conflict, but symbolic interactionism is in many ways about how we think about what is the self. So I mentioned how it's largely about meaning, the meaning of interactions, the meaning we attach to objects, but also the meaning we attach to ourselves. So for example, a Bible is a sacred, potentially otherworldly object to some people. To other people, it's just another book, maybe even a coaster. So, or doorstop. So, in that way, we can think about ourselves in that way. For example, do you tend to absorb more of the negative things people say about you or the positive things? Is your identity based more in how you think others view you, or is it on how you view you? Do you often seek validation from your romantic partner, or are you more confident and conduct yourself in a way where maybe you stand up for yourself when you have a disagreement with your partner or your friends or a coworker? And so think about this as where you gain your knowledge. Is it internal, external? So that's kind of the micro self level of analysis for interactionism. A larger one is about culture. So the easiest way to think about this is religion. Religion gives some people scripts about how to act, who to be, how to behave, what to do. It also tells us in many ways, thinking about Christianity, where we come from. And Christianity becomes a perspective through which we can think about all of society, why things are the way they are. It defines the interactions between two people of the same religion, two people of different religions, and two people of a religion, where one person is religious and one person is not. For examples, and say issues with international terrorism, sometimes that's been described as a clash of civilizations or a culture clash because of two cultures who attach very different interpretations to behavior. That behavior being geopolitics, how they interpret another country being in their country for military action. So groups construct their culture, and then in turn, cultures construct groups. So for those of you going to church, this will be not news at all. But then think about who you might be or what your life would be like if you did not do that, if you were not raised in a Catholic family. Interactionism is also really important for having us think about what we call primary socialization. We'll talk about this more in the socialization chapter, but the family unit is the primary mechanism of socialization. It's where we learn our first social cues. So take, for example, if you were raised instead out in the woods by wolves, would you become who you are now? I don't think so. Or if you were kidnapped and raised by aliens on their spaceship from a very, very, very young age, you'd be learning their culture, not our culture. But the family unit up until you go to preschool is the primary unit of socialization. It's where you learn language. It's where you learn how to interact, behavior, ideas about play. But those are But those are social processes, at least as much as, if not more than they are innate. Those have to be learned through mimicking other people. And our last part for us that we want to think about is dramaturgy. I guess one thing I want to go to is that within symbolic interactionism, it's the idea of social constructionism. It's page 31. You want to look at that section. But constructionism is this idea about how we are social creatures, socially produced, socially shaped. It's how kind of ideas and culture shape who we are, shape our ideas. Our norms, values, symbols are parts of culture. And so society constructs how we define interactions, how we interpret how we think about other people. Say for ideas about poverty. There's a whole set of assumptions and scripts that go along with seeing a homeless person or learning that someone is a felon, learning someone used to be a drug addict. And so there are socially constructed ideas. This is where we're getting back to our ideas about generalizations and stereotypes. But they shape how we interact with other people and the decisions we make about our own lives. So check out the social constructionism section. Think about how that overlaps with interactionism. Lastly, dramaturgy. Front stage and the backstage. This is from famous sociologist Erving Goffman. Think about how kind of on point you are when on a first date, when at work, particularly if it's a job where you work with the public. This is the front stage. This is where you present your best self. The backstage is where you kind of chill out, maybe you swear, act a little crude, talk about how horrible that customer who just came in was. So it's a sense of performing. But Goffman says that we do this all the time. Not just in particular social situations where we need to put our best self forward, but that we are always performing self. And so for you, even though I'm in a t-shirt in my apartment giving this video lecture, you can see my half sleeve tattoo. This is me trying to look badass. I'm still thinking about my behavior as your instructor, keeping swearing at least to a minimum. Not trying to regale you with tales of past or present soccer glory. Not telling you about stresses I have in my life, like getting my doctoral dissertation done, right? I'm still, even if I'm being pretty laid back, still trying to perform being an instructor to some degree. And so Goffman says that we perform some version of self all the time. Think about who you present yourself with your parents. Some people can be fairly laid back with their parents and they can be themselves. But other people really have to present a competent, successful self to their parents at all times. They feel like their behavior, even as they become young adults or full adults, is watched and critiqued and judged, particularly their decision making about who they become, maybe who they choose to marry. And so this is what we call the presentation of self. Think of it as maybe college students. Think of college students who come to class in their pajamas, but their makeup's done. Male students who come to classes in gym clothes, but they make sure their hair looks on point. So they're trying to look casual, but not disheveled. Check out the videos for Goffman that I posted. That'll kind of flesh this out a little bit more. I've already taken too much time. I posted a lot of videos for this chapter. Check them out. Last but not least, discussion board. I'm going to post that. I'll send them some directions in the email. But there are 6 listed on the syllabus. You post a question. You respond to one of my questions. And yeah, you respond to a question that I post and someone else's response. So you're writing 2 things in total. One for each chapter on UB Learns. There'll be a due date. This one for chapter 2 isn't due until the weekend. There are examples in the syllabus about what a good discussion question and answer looks like, so look at that as an example. And so that's what we'll start really trying to do sociology in some way, which is writing about it. Look for my email about the discussion board, email me with any questions, and I will see you soon. Thank you for listening. By the way, it is really hot here, and I want to die.